saving seeds is kind of like saving stories in a way. You know, every seed comes from a different plant, and then there's just so much history behind that seed. And I just always find myself asking, where do those seeds come from? And so it's really exciting to be here with the Green Palette webinar series because I think it's a really good opportunity for everybody who's in charge of all of these containers to kind of take it one step further and see if we can't save seeds from all of the different containers in the Collinwood neighborhood. Because I think that those seeds, you know, will go a lot further in that sense, you know, having that sense of place in the neighborhood. You know, and that being said, I think it's also really exciting to be on this webinar series because the Cleveland Seed Bank actually has a brand new urban garden in the Collinwood neighborhood. I believe it was last year we acquired a vacant parcel of land on Darwin Avenue, which is just south of Waterloo Arts, and a little bit more south than the Cleveland Food Bank, if I'm not mistaken. And so one of our big initiatives in the upcoming year is to establish this growing space with the help of community volunteers in the Collinwood neighborhood. So it's just really exciting. It feels a little serendipitous to be participating in the Green Palette webinar series right now. So thanks for having us. Oh, okay, let's see, how do I switch the slide? My talk today is an introduction to seed saving, and I have a few goals for everybody in attendance today. I'll tell you a little bit more about the seed bank and what we do in the community and what our goals are as an organization. I'll touch a little bit on where our seeds come from. It's a really fascinating question to ask ourselves. And Amy mentioned earlier, you know, the documentary Seeds. And that being said, if you really want to be inspired about, you know, seeds and where they come from and the corporate control and why seed saving is so important, I would definitely recommend everybody to take some time on the next rainy day to watch one of those documentaries. And then of course, why should we save seeds? And then I'll go through a few basic seed saving guidelines so that hopefully everybody here has the tools they need in their tool belt to save seeds this year. That being said, everybody can save seeds, anyone can save seeds, and everybody is encouraged to do so. But I would say, you know, as a seed saver, one of your goals is to save seeds that is true to type. And I'm going to use that word a lot throughout this presentation. And that essentially means that you're saving seeds because you want to plant those the following year and you want them to grow up exactly like what you expect that they're going to grow up to be. And so, you know, with that, there's a few seed saving tips that I'm going to share with everybody, but hopefully they're not too intimidating that you feel like you can't save seeds, because that's just not true. So the Cleveland Seed Bank, I wonder if I do that. Oh, I don't know. Just trying to get it out of everybody's way. So the Cleveland Seed Bank works to inspire, educate, and grow a community network of seed savers. That is our mission at this organization. And, you know, education is at the heart of what we do. I think primarily we have a lot of programs and events, and that's kind of how we build this really big network, this web of seed savers across Northeast Ohio, you know, while inspiring folks to join this large movement of saving seeds. And of course, you know, education, just continuing to pass on these tools. You know, the Cleveland Seed Bank is actually a project initiative of a larger organization called the Hummingbird Project, which is a global reaching nonprofit based in Cleveland that works for social justice through ecological regeneration and community empowerment. And it's actually a really fascinating story how the Cleveland Seed Bank was founded and how we got from, you know, point A to point B essentially. And I encourage everybody to visit our website, hummingbirdproject.org, to learn a little bit more about that story and how the organization was founded. So one of the really exciting programs that the Seed Bank does, and I don't know if anybody has actually heard of this before, it seems like every year this program gets a little bit more popular in the city of Cleveland. And it's super exciting. This year, we're actually partnering with 8 different Cleveland Public Library branches, as well as the Elyria Public Library, the Willoughby Public Library, Rocky River, and Shaker Heights. I think that's all of them. But our seed library program was a way to make seeds more accessible to those in the community, to make sure that gardeners and urban farmers and everybody in between has access to high quality, organically grown and organically saved seeds. There's 24 different varieties at any one of these given locations, and they're all listed on our website. And most of the varieties in the seed library boxes are annual vegetables, and there are a few flowers as well. But the goal is that somebody could visit this seed library at your nearest library branch and check out seed packets and have everything that you need to sustain yourself for that growing season. There's also a seed library at the Collinwood Library branch, the CPL Collinwood Library branch. And so if that is your home base, if that's your neighborhood, I encourage you to go and visit that library sometime this week and check out some seeds. Another event that the Cleveland Seed Bank does is the Winter Seed Swap, which is definitely, if you are a gardener in Northeast Ohio, this is the event for you for sure. This is one of my favorite events in the city, and I would say that even if I didn't work for the Cleveland Seed Bank. This is the Winter Seed Swap is a gathering of seed savers from near and far who come together to share all of the seeds that they've been saving together. And then with that, to share stories and celebrate the gardening season ahead. And there's live music and coffee, and it's just a really good event. And of course, this year we did not host the seed swap because of COVID, but hopefully, fingers crossed, we will have the seed swap back up and running next year. Another reason the seed swap was created was as a way to encourage folks who use the seed library program, to save seeds, because the patrons of the seed libraries don't necessarily return those seeds to the boxes. And this is a way to just encourage that seed saving, on a more grassroots level, so to speak. And finally, the Cleveland Seed Bank hosts community education and workshops throughout the community. For example, the Green Palette webinar series, and then we host seed saving workshops in partnership with all of our library branches as well. The picture on the left is actually the garden space that we recently acquired in the Collinwood neighborhood. And one of our main goals moving forward for the rest of the growing season is actually to establish this space with the help of the community and our volunteer base. And so if you are interested in getting involved, this is a great way to join the Cleveland Seed Bank at this time and to kind of help build this really permanent growing space, our new teaching space from the ground up. Okay, so that's mostly everything I want to tell you about the Cleveland Seed Bank. I could go on, but I am going to jump into the question of where do our seeds come from, which is one of my favorite questions to ask, because I feel like oftentimes we ask ourselves, where does our food come from? That is definitely a popular question that we all have begun to ask ourselves over the past couple of years. And I think it's really interesting to take it one step further and ask where those seeds come from. And so I'm taking this opportunity to tell everybody here about a couple of seed growers across the country from coast to coast who are working really hard to preserve the biodiversity that we have in our food supply today. And, I think oftentimes when we go to our local nurseries, or if we go to like our local hardware stores or whatever that may be, there's always like 2 or 3 different companies that they tend to feature, but there's actually so many people working on saving seeds in our country. And once you kind of start going down that rabbit hole of who's growing what variety and who is stewarding this variety, it becomes really, really exciting. And it's like this whole entire new door has been opened for gardeners and farmers and urban farmers and everybody in between. So just quick shout outs to all of these folks. And I encourage everybody, they're not necessarily in the state of Ohio, so to speak, but they are more or less in our region. And so we can somewhat rely on all of the seeds from these different seed companies to grow really well in our climate. And so there's Nature Nurture Seeds. That is a husband and wife duo up in Michigan in the Ann Arbor area. As an urban farmer myself, they are some of my favorite seeds to grow because, our regions are so close, but also they just have a lot of really great varieties. There's North Circle Seeds, that's in Minnesota. So True Seed is another group of folks saving seed in Asheville, North Carolina. There's High Mowing Organic Seed Company up in Vermont. That one's a little bit more popular. I'm sure we're all familiar with them. There's Baker Creek Heirlooms, of course. They are huge seed stewards in our country for vegetable and flower production. Southern Exposure Seed Exchange. This is a group of folks. This is actually a seed saving cooperative. And so all of the seed savers in this community kind of have a piece of the pie, so to speak, in this seed growing community. And then there's the Hudson Valley Seed Company up in New York. And the list could go on and on and on. I actually cut off a few seed companies because I was like, I don't know if they're going to want to know all of these people. But I encourage you to just kind of browse around and take a look at everybody who is protecting our food supply right now in our country. And that just begs the question, why should you save seeds? I think saving seeds, not only is it really fun and invigorating, and it's kind of one of those things as a gardener that once you start saving seeds, it's really hard to stop because it's almost like you've completed this plant's life cycle, so to speak. And, watching something go from seed to seed is a really special thing that happens as a gardener or an urban farmer. But primarily, the Cleveland Seed Bank and all of the seed savers across the globe, our goal as seed savers is to steward as much biodiversity as we can on our planet. Especially with changing climate and, with the seed supply being controlled by a handful of corporations, it's really kind of on us to keep the seeds in the hands of the people, more or less. It's one way that we can take control of our food supply. It's one way that we can take control of our own sustainability and the longevity of our food supply, by making this a practice in our everyday gardening. And then, of course, there's the other perks. It's a very economical thing to do. You can save money by not having to buy new seeds every year. For example, this is an amaranth seed crop that I saved last year. And I don't think I'm ever going to have to buy amaranth seed ever again after this seed crop. This is only one tray's worth, and I had 3 of these trays in the hoop house curing all winter. And so saving money is a very real concept when it comes to saving seeds. And then, of course, there's learning new skills and becoming a more knowledgeable garden, as I just said. And I think, the most exciting part of saving seeds is kind of stewarding that seed's story, finding out where that seed came from and tracing its heritage as far back as you can. One of the recent seed stories that's really exciting for me, I don't know if everybody is familiar with Larder, which is a restaurant deli on the west side of Cleveland. And I recently visited Jeremy just to ask him a question about partnering at the seed bank, actually. And he handed me a jalapeno pepper. This is actually in the fall of last year, but he handed me a jalapeno pepper and he said, "Hey, you're a seed saver. You're going to love this." And he gave me this pepper and he said, "My mom has had this jalapeno plant for the past 10 years. She started the seeds herself. She brings it in every single winter. And these peppers, this is essentially a 10-year-old pepper, more or less, but now I have this pepper, this jar of pepper seeds from Jeremy, from his mom, who's been saving the seeds for 10 years. And I don't know, I think saving seeds, one of the most inspiring parts is the stories that come with it. That was a long tangent about Jeremy's jalapeno pepper seeds, which if anybody wants any from me, I'm happy to share them with you. But diving into a little bit more of the specifics of seed saving guidelines, here are some simple tips to follow if you are setting out to save seeds for the first time this growing season. And as I mentioned, your goal as a seed saver is to make sure that these seeds are true to type. And so you don't necessarily want any of your plants to cross-pollinate, to contaminate the seeds, so to speak, although I would never think that anything that has cross-pollinated is contaminated. But if your goal is to save something and know what you're getting the following year, here are some goals. So you want to save seeds from heirloom varieties. That's always a safe bet. Saving seeds from hybrid varieties becomes pretty tricky, and I'll explain more on that later. You're going to want to collect seeds from a minimum of 6 plants of each variety, and that is just to make sure that the population size is large enough and that there's enough genetic diversity and variance within that seed crop. So the more plants, the better, versus saving seed from a single plant. It's not a bad thing, but you're just kind of increasing the strength of that seed if there's a larger population. You're going to want to minimize cross-pollination between species, and so separating different varieties of the same crop. So let's just say that you have, 2 different types of tomatoes in your garden. You might want to put a little bit of distance in between them to make sure that they don't cross-pollinate, so that those seeds are true the following year. And then you're going to want to save seeds from the best plants, and you don't want to save seeds from anything that is less than. And so taking a look in your garden, anything that looks like it's kind of been struggling throughout the year, or maybe it's infested by aphids or some other pest, you're going to want to save seeds from the crops that are performing, that are outperforming whatever those things may be in the garden. Okay, so a little bit more about heirloom, open pollinated, and hybrid. Seed savers can save seeds from anything that is open pollinated and almost every single heirloom variety. But you cannot really save seeds from hybrids. You can, but again, that true to type, you're not really going to be sure what comes from that hybrid. And you can find out if something is open pollinated and if something is an heirloom just by reading the seed packet. Sometimes you can even do a quick Google search. It's not always going to be accurate, but sometimes if I don't know if something is a hybrid or not, I can jump onto Google really quickly and, it'll most of the time tell me whether or not it's an heirloom or if it's an open pollinated or a hybrid. And let's see, heirloom and open pollinated, just breaking those up a little bit more. Heirloom they're plants that have a history being passed down within a family or community. I like to think of things that are ancient, that have tradition, things that are valued within a community, and they're passed down for a certain reason, whether it's the traits, whether it just comes with that story, kind of like Jeremy's jalapeno peppers, anything that's kind of being passed down through a lineage. And then open pollination is when anything is openly pollinated the natural way that it should be it by humans, insects, birds, or wind, whatever that may be. And those seeds, plants that are open pollinated, are much more genetically diverse, and they're able to adapt to our local growing conditions year after year. And I don't know if I clearly mentioned that earlier, but another benefit of saving seeds, and something that the Cleveland Seed Bank really strives to do, is to build this regional seed supply. Again, in the face of a changing climate, we are kind of leaning into our network of seed savers to help us support this seed supply that is grown by people in Northeast Ohio, and it's grown for people in Northeast Ohio. And that's one way that this network of seed savers really works together to ensure a seed supply in our community. Hybrids are really exciting and fascinating. So hybrid is essentially a controlled method of pollination, and so it's an intentional breeding between different species that are crossed, and it's usually done by human intervention, and so this is intentional. most of the time, if you're I guess I should backtrack and say that if you're growing a crop that is a hybrid, it was intentionally crossed, versus something that might naturally cross pollinate in your backyard garden. That's a little bit different, and that is also considered a hybrid. Um, and hybrids are really exciting for the modern farmer, I should say, just because hybrids are created for specific traits and flavors. Hybrids are used by farmers because they have a very reliable production. Essentially, a farmer knows what they're going to get if they're growing a hybrid crop. And I guess just moving further, if you were to save seeds from a hybrid seed crop, it's not necessary. You cannot be sure what you're going to get the following season from seeds saved from hybrids. There's no sure way to tell which one of those parents the genes are going to be expressed from the following year. So thinking about seed saving, you're going to always want to check and see what species your plant is in your backyard garden. And so plants typically cross-pollinate within their own species, and they usually will not cross between species, and that's a pretty safe bet. So taking a look at my pepper seed packets at the bottom, these are two different peppers. This is the cayenne hot pepper, and this is a hot wax pepper, but they do belong to the same species. And so I know that there is a chance that they're going to cross, and I'm not sure exactly which peppers I'm going to get the following year, which is totally fine. I think, saving seeds from plants that may have crossed in your backyard is a wonderful experiment to do, and I think every gardener should go through that experience. But if you are intentionally trying to save something for a specific trait, or if it does have that story attached to it, you're going to want to be a little bit more intentional. And so being mindful of the different species that are in your backyard garden is one way to think about cross-pollinating, and making sure you have seeds that are true to type. Diving a little bit further into pollination. So there are two different types of flowers when we talk about pollinating in the backyard garden. There are the perfect flowers, those that can pollinate themselves, which means that they have both of the reproductive organs that they need on a single flower. So they're not necessarily going to have to rely on anything else in nature to pollinate themselves. They can do everything they need to produce seeds on their own. We call those perfect flowers, and I call these the golden six just because they're the easiest things to start saving seed from this year in your garden. So we have beans and peas, tomatoes and peppers, and lettuce and eggplant. And all six of these crops have perfect flowers, meaning they have everything that they need to produce seeds on their own. You don't really have to put a lot of distance in between species that might be the same in your garden. I think with most of these crops right here, you can probably put 10 feet in between like your different tomato plants, your different eggplants, whatever that may be. And you would most likely have seed that is true to type the following year. Contrary to the perfect flowers are the imperfect flowers, and these are the flowers that will cross-pollinate, meaning they have to rely on some kind of intervention to pollinate themselves and produce seed. So there's usually a male flower, there's usually a female flower, and interestingly enough, they can exist on the same exact plant, or they can exist on opposite plants. And so thinking about seed saving, this is a squash plant, and this has the male squash flower and the female squash flower. And so you would think that the pollination doesn't have to go very far necessarily, but if you happen to have, 3 different types of summer squash in your garden, the chances of cross-pollinating and mixing those different genes and coming up with your own hybrid are a little bit higher than if you were to separate these with some great distance. And then there's the two-home flowers. This is a spinach plant, which is super fascinating. So there's actually an entire stalk with male flowers and an entire stalk with female reproductive organs. And so, you know, something like this where the plants have two different homes, essentially, you're going to want a really large population size in order to save seeds um, from a crop with two homes. And so ways that you can prevent cross-pollinating in your backyard garden. The easiest way is just through different methods of isolation. And so let's say, for example, that you do want to grow 3 different types of squash. You can time them accordingly throughout the garden. So you can have your first squash plant blooming in mid-July. You can have the second one blooming towards the end of August. And you could you know, do that with many different crops in your backyard garden. Timing is a really valuable way to ensure that things are pollinating at different times in the garden and things are going to seed at different times if you're trying to be intentional. The easiest way is just to put distance between your seed crops. You can leverage the structures that exist on your property. So if that's a garage or a shed, maybe you have some smaller areas that are subtle microclimates or whatever that may be. You can definitely put distance in between your seed crops. This year in my garden, I am actually growing a seed crop in between 2 pea trellises because I know that those pea trellises are going to grow to at least 4 feet in height, and I know that's going to kind of create this intentional barrier in between, you know, the rest of the plants on my farm versus that seed crop that's right in the center of those pea trellises. Another way, if you look down at this middle picture, and I haven't done this myself, but we are interested in hosting a workshop this season on this. You can actually, you know, put physical barriers in the sense of bagging things or taping flowers off. You know, this is a bagged ear of corn in that middle picture, and then this is a taped off flower of a squash plant. And you'll notice that that squash plant is also marked. And so if you are trying to take your seed saving to the next intentional level, you can identify the plants that you've intentionally pollinated, you know, with markers or by taping things off, by putting screens around them. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully talking about plants cross-pollinating or self-pollinating isn't intimidating everybody into thinking that they can't save seeds, because that's simply not true. Those are just things to keep in mind. You know, the world, the garden is constantly moving and things are pollinating and seeds are being created. But when you get to the end of the season and you're wondering, you know, what should I save seeds from? We always recommend that you select for the best traits. For example, this is a stocky red roaster pepper, and you can see that this gardener is most likely going to save seeds from the 2 peppers that are on the right side of the shears versus the peppers on the left. You know, the peppers on the left are, you know, shaped differently. Some seem to be a little waxy or not waxy enough. They're discolored. The sizing isn't just right versus the 2 on the right. You know, those are the genetics that you would like to see in the following pepper crops. And so you'll want to take seeds from your best of your best of your best, if possible. And earlier we were talking about this before we started the webinar. Danny and I were talking about when are seeds ready, which is a very valuable question with seed saving, because every seed is ready at a different time. You know, seeds that are dry processed are most of the time, it's self-explanatory to know like when a seed is ready just based on whether the flower head is fully dry and you can pinch it and you can find those seeds very easily, or if you were saving seeds from something like beans or peas, you know, it's very easy to tell when those seeds are ready, of course, versus something like a cucumber or a pepper. You know, you're not necessarily saving seeds at the same exact time that you might be consuming that fruit or that vegetable. For example, this is a bowl of cucumbers that we would consider peak ripeness for eating because they're crunchy. and they look really immature compared to a seed crop of cucumbers. You know, things like cucumbers and melons and zucchini and peppers, you're going to want those seed crops to fully ripen in the field. And so there is just a little bit of difference, you know, those fruiting bodies need a little bit longer to ripen so that those seeds are fully mature versus something that just dries off in the field as well. And so let's just say that everybody feels inspired enough to start saving their seeds this year. There are 3 general methods with saving seeds. I just kind of touched on them a little bit, but there is the dry seed processing. And these are seeds that dry on the plant and then they have to be kept dry until they're sown the following year. So most grains and beans, peas, lettuces, arugula, most herbs and most flowers, it's somewhat safe to say, are all dry seed processing. And so, you know, this will just take a little bit more work on the seed savers end to kind of remove that seed from the plant matter, which is the goal of all seed processing, I should say. You know, once you're taking the seeds from the outdoors to the inside, you're going to want to separate it from as much plant matter as possible just to keep the longevity of that seed. And so on a large seed scale, seed saving process, I should say, you know, there's threshing, winnowing, and screening. And we recently did this with Praxis Fiber Workshop when we were processing an indigo seed crop, actually. You know, threshing is when you're kind of beating the seed out of the plant matter, and people can step on this. People will usually use tools to just any way that you can separate that seed from the plant. Winnowing is when you're kind of using the wind as your tool to remove any of that really light matter. And then of course there's screening, which is the easiest way to separate seeds from your plants. But the goal with seed processing, especially those dry processing, is definitely to get rid of any plant matter because you don't want that to affect the seed while it is in storage. There's also wet processing, and this is a really common one. I think this is probably one of the easier ways to start saving seeds. This is when you are just simply taking seeds from a fruit and you're picking, you're scooping, you're rinsing, and you're drying, and it is that simple. I would say almost every single fruiting body is a wet processing versus tomatoes, which are a fermentation processing. And you don't always have to ferment your tomato seeds, but I think it definitely aids in the process of saving the seeds. So fermentation processing is when you, kind of like this picture, you know, you would cut a tomato in half and you would squeeze the contents of that tomato into a jar. Cover it with a little bit of water and then let that seed ferment for at least 24 to 48 hours to be safe. And what happens is, you know, much like the tomato would in your backyard garden, by falling off of the vine, rotting in place, and then having dozens of tomatoes sprout up the following year, you're essentially recreating that process in your kitchen. You're trying to remove that really filmy coat, that protecting of the seed by fermentation. And finally, once you've gotten to the point where you have saved seeds from your garden, your next big task is to work on your storage. And so seeds want to be stored in every opposite way that they don't want anything that they need to grow. So you're going to want to remove the air, the water, any moisture, keeping them as cold as possible, no sunlight. And your goal through your seed storage is just to make the seeds last as long as they possibly can. You know, that being said, seeds do have a shelf life and every seed is completely different. I know, for example, that onion seeds generally only last for 1 year. I have yet to come across any onions that will sprout, you know, on year 2 of them being saved versus something like beans. You know, you can plant beans that you might have had for 10 years and they're probably going to germinate. yeah, your goal with seed storage is just to maximize the longevity of that seed's life. And I think that might be everything in terms of, basic guidelines for saving seeds. I do have some really pretty pictures at the end of this presentation, just to kind of show you, what you might be looking for this year in your garden. And so just taking a look at the eggplants at the top, you're probably going to eat that purple eggplant, but you'll want to take seeds from an eggplant that has matured on the vine a little bit longer. Same with tomato seeds, of course. Uh, the moment that you would eat the ripest tomato in your garden is the same time that you would also want to save that seed. And then same with peppers. And Danny and I were talking about that earlier. It sounds like he had saved seeds from a green bell pepper. And we were just touching on the fact that peppers probably want to ripen a little bit longer on the vine. And your goal there is just to let them go to full maturity as much as possible. This is the cucurbit family. So this is cucumbers and squash and zucchini, and then most melons. And to the best of my knowledge, almost all of these are just the wet processing, and you won't necessarily have to worry about fermentation. I did work for a seed grower at one time who did ferment their, I think it was their cucumber seeds on a large scale. They had a huge bin on their farm, and we just scooped cucumbers for days into this big bin, and then we just let them soak for, I think it was 2 days. But it was noticeable that that cucumber had that mushy film on it. But it's not necessary that you ferment those. The legume family, these are seeds that are going to be dry processed, and so these are going to want to ripen on the vine as long as possible. You'll notice that those pods will start to shrivel and kind of wrap themselves around those seeds, which is a good indicator that they are ripe and they are ready to be processed. And then there's the brassica family, which reminds me that the one thing I didn't touch on in the presentation is a seed's life cycle, and there are annual seed crops and annual food crops which produce seed in one full year versus something like the brassica family, which is a biennial seed crop, meaning it'll actually take them 2 years to produce seed. And this picture right here on the left is one of my favorite pictures of a cabbage plant going to seed. And so in that first full year, that cabbage plant just simply grew a head of cabbage, and the farmers left it there in the Pacific Northwest. They left it in the field all season, and then that following spring, the center of that cabbage started to sprout its second life, which are the flowers on the right, and then the seeds on the bottom right. And so something like a brassica, not all brassicas, but handfuls of brassicas will take 2 years to produce seed, which is a little tricky in Northeast Ohio for those biennial seed crops, just because we have cold winters and freezing temperatures. It would take a little bit more work on our end to save biennials here. And finally, carrots. Carrots are also a biennial seed crop. And so they will take 2 years to produce seed. But that being said, I do have a bunch of carrots in the ground from last growing season that managed to survive the winter, even though we had a pretty honest winter up here. But they are all, starting to sprout their seed heads this spring as we speak. Okay, and how can you get involved with the Cleveland Seed Bank? Hopefully, everybody can get involved this growing season by simply saving seeds on your own and keeping in touch with the Cleveland Seed Bank. Joining this network of seed savers in Northeast Ohio. But more specifically, you are all invited to join the virtual Seed Swap Facebook group that we created. We created this in lieu of the in-person Seed Swap this year. And it's a really it was an easy way for us to kind of keep the conversation of saving seeds and to tap into, this idea of porch pickups and deliveries and using the post office and keeping connected some way, somehow. And on the Facebook group, there's actually a lot of really active seed savers and seed swappers, and everybody's really creative in how they're sharing seeds with each other this year. So everybody's invited to join the Facebook group. And of course, volunteer with us. We are definitely looking for volunteers to help us establish the growing space in the Collinwood neighborhood that I mentioned earlier, as well as other projects and events that we need assistance with. And you can also become a donor and support the work that we do in Ohio. The Cleveland Seed Bank is primarily funded through a handful of small grants in the Cleveland neighborhoods, as well as corporate sponsorships and individual donors across the city. And that's everything for everybody today. This is my email address, and I would love to hear from everybody if you have any follow-up questions.
Yeah, thank you for
Great to
coming.
meet you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.